Well, hello, comrades and friends, and welcome back once again to the Southern Socialist broadcast, podcast, whatever you want to call it. Coming to you from Fortified Mountain in the Upper South from the Eugene Debs Memorial Studios. This is episode 2 of the Southern Socialist. I want to thank all of you who listened in last week and all of you who subscribed, and I hope that you are enjoying the program so far. I want to remind you that you can always get in touch with me if you have questions or comments about the broadcast, or maybe even want to suggest a subject or a topic you'd like me to talk about. I would certainly be glad to do that, and of course you can reach me in a variety of ways. I got a couple of email addresses, the Southern Socialist at yahoo.com, the Southern Socialist at yahoo.com. Also have the Southern Socialist Show, the Southern Socialist Show at gmail.com. And of course, you can find me on Instagram, _Southern Socialist. Still having a bit of trouble with Facebook, but I am on Twitter, of course, too. And I would always welcome the opportunity to speak to you. I'd like to point out just a couple of things before we get started this week. And man, there's so much crazy stuff going on in the world. Had a really hard time trying to narrow down a broadcast. Your comrade, the Southern Socialist, has been working on this all week long. First, I'd like to point out that this is a non-sectarian broadcast. I don't represent on this program any certain tendency or party or group or anything like that. As a matter of fact, I think that now more than ever, the left should be working together and getting together and not fighting battles from the past or 100 years ago or 150 years ago or the Russian Revolution. The left needs to get together right now. And any kind of differences we have, I think that we can iron those out now. Secondly, I'd like to mention there's a lot of places you can go to get some good information. Some of the people I like to follow, there is a Marxian economist named Richard D. Wolff, 2 F's, W-O-L-F-F. He has a program on YouTube. He's, I think, on Russia Today, the cable network. He also has a podcast called Economic Update, and he is a member of an organization called Democracy at Work. Professor Wolff, Richard Wolff, has been doing some really good work for a very long time on social change and socialism, Marxist economics, and things like that. Also, of course, Chris Hedges is a very good journalist. Now, I don't agree with everything all these people say, but they're doing some really good work, and I get a lot of information from them. Chris Hedges writes for truthdig.com. He also has a program on Russia Today called On Contact with Chris Hedges, and I really appreciate his efforts at putting information out there, and he does a lot of good editorialization. There's also, of course, Professor Noam Chomsky, who is still out there, been doing good work for a very long time. He's one of my formative intellectual influences. And there's some very good press out there from the various left parties. The Socialist Party has a good press, the Democratic Socialist of America. The Communist Party has the People's World. The International Socialist Tendency, which they have a really good publication called International Socialist Review that I really like to read. Some very good journalism analysis in that. So I am non-sectarian. I want everybody, no matter what your tendency or belief system, to be able to listen to this program and appreciate it and get something out of it. And let's all get along and work together. Let's make the world a better place. That's what I want to do. Well, I'd like to start off this week just discussing a little bit, not very much, the Democratic debates. They're not really, to be honest, worth discussing that much. There's a lot of political sideshow theater going on there, a lot of topics they're covering that really are only surface issues at best. You know, I appreciate what Bernie Sanders is trying to do. He calls himself a democratic socialist. I take him at his word. If you analyze him from a Marxist viewpoint, he's really not much of a socialist, probably not much of a Marxist at all. But, you know, again, I'm not judging people. I'm just saying that Bernie is a reformist. He is actually not as far left as a lot of New Deal Democrats were in the 1930s and 40s. But Bernie is trying to do some good work, trying to advocate some sort of positive change. I also appreciate what Elizabeth Warren's done. Personally, I'm a little skeptical of Elizabeth because she likes to trumpet that she's a capitalist, and she was a Republican till she was 47 years old. I am for any sort of positive progress or change. I know that it's going to take us a lot to get there. We have to do incremental small steps. But there's something going on right now that really amazes me, and that's all those establishment Democrats that get up there and say, we can't afford to do this and we can't do that. I thought the United States of America was the most prosperous, rich, wealthy, can-do nation on earth. We put a man on the moon, and now we can't even fix our bridges and pave our roads. Now we can't even tax billionaires. And, of course, by the way, I see good old shifty Ted Cruz, who I like to refer to, if you ever watched the old TV show The Munsters, as Grandpa Munster. That's who he looks like to me. Although Grandpa Munster was a left-wing progressive, so he was a comrade. Ted Cruz is anything but. But Ted Cruz is trying to convince our esteemed president to put through a special additional tax cut for millionaires and billionaires. That's right, by executive order. Congress not included in that. Why are we doing this? Well, that's because, again, we have a class-based state. Our political system is completely held hostage to the millionaires and the billionaires, the 1%, the 0.1%, and public opinion polls, people who say they want this and that done. These politicians don't care about that. But here are these establishment Democrats getting up there and saying, we can't do this, we can't do that. Well, why not? Of course, obviously, it's because the business class doesn't want it done, but they don't want you to dream too big, my friends. They don't want you to ask for too much. They want you to scrounge for crumbs and accept what you've gotten. And that, of course, is one of the big problems. That's why change never happens. Now, again, Senator Sanders and Senator Warren are both reformists. They are not revolutionaries. They do not want to abolish capitalism. I mean, the actual old Marxist definition of socialism is the abolition of capitalism, the expropriation of the means of production by the working class. And Bernie has not said anything about anything like that. He doesn't even want to do that. He just wants some mild reforms. But throughout history, and I'm going to do a special episode of this program about that. As a matter of fact, it might be the next one I do. If you look at history, history tells you that you have two choices. Either you allow reform or you get revolution. Now, when I talk about revolution, I'm talking about revolution in the old sense that Marx and Engels talked about. Working people are the majority. Working people are the ones who make stuff, build stuff, and do stuff. They do the work, and labor creates wealth. Wealth, of course, a lot of it is inherited. I've seen various studies and graphs and charts, but somewhere between 40 and 51% of all the wealth in the world today is inherited. But wealth is still earned, and wealth cannot be earned without working people. Stuff cannot be made. It cannot be built. Offices can't function. Nothing functions without working people. We create the wealth, but we only get a very small portion of it in the form of a wage. And the wage, they want us to be given just enough to survive on, just enough to live on, and enough to have a little bit of money to spend, right? Just a little bit, because we do have economy now that's based on 2/3 on consumer goods. You can't have a 2/3 consumer economy without allowing working people to have some sort of money to spend. The problem is, of course, that corporations don't want to give up even a little bit of their profit. Wealthy people do not want to give up a little bit of their money in the form of taxes or anything else, especially not higher wages, even though that would benefit them, because if we made better wages, we would spend that money and we would have a humming consumer economy. We would all go out and spend that money and buy all kinds of stuff, but their greed will not allow them to do this. And that's one of the many contradictions of capitalism that Marx and Engels pointed out repeatedly. But here we are, the Democrats once again, except for two of them, saying we can't do this and we can't do that and we've got to maintain the status quo. Well, the status quo is rotten to the core, exhausted, and out of ideas, and we need to change that. A lot of what we're talking about is a criminal justice system, and there's a lot of issues and a lot of problems there too. We need criminal justice reform. But you know what? We're really not going to get much because crime pays. I don't care what they tell you, crime pays. Nobody wants to win the war on drugs because the war on drugs creates too much money for people. That's one of the few things that you can actually get money for is law enforcement and things like that. And when I look around in the town where I live, most of the money that circulates here is due to crime. Now, Marx said in the economic manuscripts of 1861 to 1863, a philosopher, I'm quoting here from Marx, a philosopher produces ideas, a poet poems, a clergyman sermons, a professor compendia, and so on. A criminal produces crimes. If we take a closer look at the connection between this latter branch of production and society as a whole, we shall rid ourselves of many prejudices, and don't we need that? Going back to the text, the criminal produces not only crimes, but also criminal law, and with this also the professor who gives lectures on criminal law. And in addition to this, the inevitable compendium in which this same professor throws his lectures onto the general market as commodities. This brings with it augmentation of national wealth, quite apart from the personal enjoyment which, as a competent witness, Professor Rocher tells us, the manuscript of the compendium brings to its originator itself. The criminal, moreover, produces the whole of the police and criminal justice, constables, judges, hangmen, juries, etc., and all these different lines of business, which form just as many categories of the social division of labor, develop different capacities of the human mind, and create new needs and new ways of satisfying them. Torture has given rise to the most ingenious mechanical inventions. The criminal produces an impression partly moral and partly tragic, as the case may be, and in this way renders a service, quote unquote, by arousing the moral and aesthetic feelings of the public, the anti-hero, the John Dillinger type. He produces not only compendia of criminal law, not only penal codes along with him legislators in this field, but also art, belles lettres, novels, even tragedies, not only Milner's Schuld and Schiller's Räuber Show, but Oedipus and Richard III. The criminal breaks the monotony and everyday security of bourgeois life. In this way, he keeps it from stagnation and gives rise to that uneasy tension and agility without which even the spur of competition will get blunted. Thus, he gives a stimulus to the productive forces, while crime takes a part of the redundant population off the labor market and reduces competition among the laborers up to a certain point, preventing wages from falling below the minimum. The struggle against crime absorbs another part of the population. Thus, the criminal comes in as one of those natural counterweights which bring about a correct balance and open up a whole perspective of useful, quote-unquote, occupations. The effects of the criminal on the development of productive power can be shown in detail. Would locks have ever reached their present degree of excellence had there been no thieves? Would the making of banknotes have reached its present perfection had there been no forgers? Would the microscope have found its way into the sphere of ordinary commerce but for trading frauds? Does not practical chemistry owe just as much to the adulteration of commodities and the efforts to show it up as to the honest zeal for production? Crime, though its ever new methods of attack on property, constantly calls into being new methods of defense, and so is as productive as strikes for the invention of machines. And if one leaves the sphere of private crime, would the world market ever have come into being but for national crime? Indeed, would even the nations have arisen? So we see there that crime does pay. It brings into being a whole apparatus of police and police state and lawyers and courts and judges and, weapons makers for criminals to use weapons with and doctors to patch the criminals and their victims up. Nobody wants to win the war on crime. So that's a very good example of one of these surface issues that really we should get a little deeper than. We should be talking more about what it takes to make the world a better place to live in. And one of the reasons for so much drug abuse in my community and in communities around the nation and around the world is the hopelessness of life, the meaninglessness of these dead-end jobs, struggling for basic needs in life, not having any feeling of worth or usefulness in your life. and the insecurity and instability of formerly middle class white collar positions, which, as we talked about last week, are now being done away with. Wages stagnating since 1973, actually declining relative to inflation. So these are the sorts of subjects and topics that you never really hear that much about. And this is the sort of deep analysis that Marxism does. And that's, of course, its primary usefulness. Marx called his philosophy dialectical materialism, and that is that, to make it a very short and simple sort of summary here, that opposites of thought, the subjects and the objects and the different oppositional thoughts come together in new ways to in a sense iron out those tensions. So you have the hypothesis and the antithesis, and they make a new synthesis. But it's materialism in the sense that it looks at what's really happening in the world. So dialectics, a perfect example, is what I've just said. They tell us don't do crime, crime doesn't pay. But if we didn't do crime, the lawyers wouldn't have a job, the police wouldn't have a job, the judges wouldn't have that much to judge, the doctors wouldn't have that many people to patch up. Crime does pay. But if you're a victim of it, of course, it's a different thing entirely. But that sort of hopelessness and empty meaning in life is leading to a lot of crime, a lot of drug abuse, a lot of alcoholism, and a lot of other negative things in our society. But instead, all we can talk about is lock 'em up, lock 'em up, lock 'em up. This sort of discourse in our society is scapegoating of certain groups of people. And there's a lot of racism in this too. The idea that, as our esteemed, not so esteemed leader says, we're getting the criminals from the rest of the world. We got plenty of criminals right here in this country. And of course, I always like to quote Woody Guthrie from his song, Pretty Boy Floyd. Through this life you travel, you'll meet some funny men. Some will rob you with a 6-gun and some with a fountain pen. And that, of course, is very true. But the Democratic debates, I don't know what's going to happen. I suspect, just like in 2016, the establishment of the Democratic Party and the big money donors are going to get together, and they're going to do everything possible to try to keep him from getting the nomination. But beyond that, this sort of politics is a big sideshow, and it's just a form of distraction, to be honest, rather than anything else. And by the way, as I said last week, I come from slave owners. And I'm very aware of that. And as a white man who lives in the South, I'm very aware of racism. And I have done everything I can possibly do through my whole life to get rid of any kind of residual racism that I was acculturated into. And I see again and again in history and in my life that racism is another one of these distractions. People in power want you to hate somebody who has a different skin tone than you, because if you're hating and blaming them, you won't blame the people who are really making your life miserable. You won't blame the people who are really working you and paying you almost nothing. You won't blame the right people for the problems, and you won't come up with the right solutions if you have a head full of racism. Racism has been used to divide and conquer people as far back in history as you can possibly go. Divide and conquer strategy is how Julius Caesar defeated the Celts in what later became France. It's the way that Montezuma and the Aztec Empire were defeated by the Spanish. And divide and conquer has been used to destroy leftist political parties, trade unions, all kinds of social organizations, and they're still using that today. Do not fall for that. Do not be a racist. Because let me tell you something, if you're a working person, you have more in common with workers from Guatemala and Mexico and Cuba and anywhere else than you do with wealthy people in your own country. I guarantee you that the things that you talk about around your dinner table tonight are not going to be the same kind of things that the extremely wealthy in this country are talking about. And that is why Marxism talked about international solidarity of the working class. And we still haven't got there. We still fall for this racist distractionism. And that is truly, truly tragic. And it's costing people their lives. I can remember very well back in the 1990s, Hillary Clinton getting on television and talk about how we have to have very strict laws on crime because the super predators, meaning she was talking about African Americans, and she was specifically talking about African Americans, babies who had been born addicted to crack. She said they would be super predators in the future. We have to do something about this. And it's shocking to me to know that so many people, especially African Americans, voted for her after she made that statement. Joe Biden, right now, one of the architects of those draconian anti-crime laws. Lots of people want to vote for him. Joe Biden was a joke through the 8 years of President Obama's administration. Why in the world is that guy running for president? Well, because, of course, the big money interest, which he is in the pocket of because he lives in a state where the credit card companies and the big companies and the corporations have had that guy as their main representative, looking out for their interests for decade after decade after decade. So do not be fooled by this discourse and by these people. Well, one of the things I learned a long time ago is that if you're going to make it through this world, you have to keep a sense of humor. And reading Hermann Hesse's Steppenwolf a long time ago definitely got me to talk about that. But sometimes things just aren't too funny. And our political sideshow of the week this week is a confirmation of something that many of us have long known. It's not funny, but it got laughs. Recently, declassified documents have shown that Ronald Reagan was a racist. Now, of course, if you've listened to the Watergate tapes, you know that Richard Nixon was a raving racist, especially an anti-Semite. But President Reagan, well, I've heard all my life that he was a fair man, didn't have a racist bone in his body. But now we know that when the United Nations voted to recognize China in 1971, the delegates from Tanzania danced in happiness over that vote going through. And Ronald Reagan called then President Nixon. Reagan was then governor of California. Nixon, of course, was the president. And Reagan said to Nixon, I quote, "To watch that thing on television as I did, to see those monkeys from those African countries, damn them, they're still uncomfortable wearing shoes," Reagan told Nixon, and Reagan and Nixon erupted into laughter. So I guess that explains Reagan's discourse on the black welfare queens who were too lazy to work and were gaming the system and supposedly got so much welfare that they could drive around in Cadillacs, which people have said for a long time was racist, and of course it was. But it's no surprise to me whatsoever, and it's no surprise that Reagan was talking to Nixon because Nixon is the man who helped to draft the Southern strategy that turned the South racist and has now turned the Republican Party into such a racist organization. Lyndon Johnson, when he signed the Civil Rights Bill in 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965, and by the way, the Voting Rights Act of 1965 was recently gutted by the right-wing Supreme Court, and now places who have a proven history of unfairly preventing people from voting and or purging them from the voter rolls are now specifically taken out from under the 1965 Voting Rights Act. It is a sham democracy, so-called democracy, which is not much of a democracy in a class state, is now becoming a complete sham. It's very obvious. But of course, none of our intrepid Democratic candidates are talking about this. But when Lyndon Johnson pushed through the Voting Rights Act of 1965, and he signed it, that and the Civil Rights Act the previous year, he said, "I have delivered the Republican Party to the South." And he was right. He did deliver the South to the Republican Party, and Nixon decided to take advantage of this with his discourse about the silent majority, which Trump, of course, has picked up too. Being the law and order candidate and all those things. Reaching out to Southerners and getting them to turn Republican, which they are now. I live in a county that is majority Republican right now by a long shot, and we have plenty of members of the Trump cult that live around here. And by the way, that's one of the reasons I'm not using my real name on this broadcast, in addition to the fact that I have family members whom I don't want their livelihoods harmed by my political activities. My name really doesn't matter anyway. It's not about me. It's about us. You wouldn't recognize my name anyway. I'm certainly not anybody famous or well-known, but that's the kind of thing that we have to do sometimes these days. But the South is solidly Republican, and that sort of dog whistle racism, little phrases like law and order and welfare queens, believe me, racist white Southerners know exactly what those phrases mean, and because of that, and because of abortion, and because of the perceived threat to firearms, which the government's not going to come in and confiscate their firearms, but they spread this paranoia, this panic discourse. The South is now solidly Republican, and that is thanks to Nixon. And Reagan was the one who picked up that ball and ran with it. So no surprise to me whatsoever that Ronald Reagan was a racist. And of course, the end of the article, we have a sort of a restatement of this in the sense that President Nixon went to Secretary of State William Rogers and said to him how he'd talked to Reagan, and Reagan had said this, and the president wanted the Secretary of State to understand that Reagan spoke to racist Americans and that those racist Americans needed to be listened to, they needed to be catered to, they needed to be coddled. And our current president has done that, of course, by saying that there were some very fine people in Charlottesville, and he is continuing his racist tweets, which are no longer sort of little coded dog whistles, but they're pretty open. It's a shame that in 2019 we are still seeing this sort of appeal, but nevertheless, we are. This sort of thing, of course, will continue until we put a stop to it. In fact, all this stuff I'm talking about and all the problems that we have will continue until we put a stop to it. And all we have to do is stop it. We are the majority. We are the 99%. And working people and interested, sympathetic, middle-class, white-collar, or even upper-class people, we need to get together and we need to do something about this. If we withdraw our permission from this system, it will fall. Because like I told you, it's working people that create the value. We create the wealth. We create the products. We vote for these clowns. We put up with this racism, and we can stop it. But we have to work together. We have to work together to put an end to this. And we have to withdraw our permission from this system. And this system will fall because this system cannot function without us. And you better believe me, the people in power, they know this. That's why you get propaganda every single day reminding you how great America is, how great American capitalism is. We used to talk about making the world safe for democracy. Well, honey, that was 100 years ago. Now we want to make the world safe for American business interests. We want to make the world safe for capitalism. We want to exploit cheap labor around the world. We want to get all those nice raw materials around the world and steal them from the local people and kill them if they speak up. But this system will continue as long as we allow it. We need to get together and put a stop to it, because it can't function without us. Every day we hear constant barrages of propaganda. The way things are now are the way things have always been. This is the best possible system. All we need is one more tax cut, and then things will be good again. Okay, well, that one didn't work, so we need one more tax cut, and then things will be good, because we promise it will trickle down on your head, and you will Your little boat will rise as well as the yacht does, and all these myths that we are told and that people begin to believe. Recently, I've been watching on Showtime the series The Loudest Voice about Roger Ailes, the head of Fox News. And, this is a guy who manipulated the hell out of people for most of his life, and that's what he made his money doing. Towards the end of his life, he actually started to believe this stuff. He actually started to believe it and becoming incredibly paranoid. A lot of times when I hear these people like Ann Coulter and Sean Hannity and these goons like all these Fox News people and Tucker Carlson, I don't think they actually believe half of what they say. But over time, they might actually convince themselves that it's true. That's a well-known psychological effect. But this system cannot function without us, and we can stop it anytime we want to. All we have to do is get our heads out of the sand, get our rears off the chair, and get out in the streets and do something about it. And we can do that as soon as we're ready. Rosa Luxemburg and many people throughout history have talked about the general strike. If you don't do their jobs, if you don't make their stuff, if you don't pay them their money, if you don't vote for them, if you don't participate in the system, it will collapse. It will fall. It only functions because we are allowing it to, and we are blaming someone else for it, and we are usually blaming the wrong people. And part of this myth-making that we are subjected to is the short memories that we get through our media. And the media, of course, the vast majority of it is a representative of these class interests. These people feel like they're a part of this class, even though they're the trained monkeys and spokesperson for it. But a lot of this stuff, you hear this discourse and all these Republicans and all these libertarians and Tea Party people saying, oh my God, we got to do something about the national debt. We got to do something about the national debt. Well, now Trump is racking up national debt through these endless wars. All the other presidents, the last few have also had a hand in that, of course. But the Republicans, I thought, were going to stop this. Instead, they've got one tax cut underway. They want to get another tax cut underway. They're fighting endless wars. They're racking up military budgets. They're building balloons now to surveil you with. That's right. I read that this morning in the Guardian newspaper. Now the national security state has balloons up in the sky that they are going to follow us with and listen to us with and watch us with. Meanwhile, we don't have the money to build new bridges or to repair old ones or to pave roads or to build infrastructure. Why don't we have a good rail system in this country? You can go to Europe and get on a bullet train and be anywhere in a very short period of time. We don't have anything like that because we've lost our national will, because we have turned our state, our government, our society over to the super wealthy who only want to make as much profits as possible, stash it in a foreign bank somewhere so they don't have to pay cost on it and forget about it. Meanwhile, the deficit gets larger and larger and larger. A lot of people say that Reagan won the Cold War and restored American optimism and done all this great stuff. But this guy ran up a budget deficit that was absolutely insane, the biggest in history at that time period. All these myths that were believed, all this short-term memory that we have because of the lousy media that we have, which is really just a propaganda arm of the state. I mean, man, people talk about, Pravda in the Soviet Union, how the media in communist nations was just so full of lies. Our media is full of lies too. Our media is censored. Business interests and advertisers can kill any story anytime they want to if they didn't like it. And I've seen that in action myself. We have a security state. We have a surveillance state. We have a spy state that any communist nation anywhere in the country except for China, which has a big one now, they would have envied the hell out of. We've got the biggest one in the world. And people don't see the hypocrisy there. The amount of hypocrisy in this is absolutely staggering. And of course it exists because we don't pay attention, and if we do pay attention, we soon forget. To conclude the program today, I'd like to speak about the man whose name I mention every week on this broadcast, and that's Eugene V. Debs, the man I named my studio after. Debs was born in 1855 in Terre Haute, Indiana, and died in 1926. He was one of the best-known men of his time, a very famous American in his lifetime. He started out as a Democrat. He spent some time in the State General Assembly in Indiana and worked on the railroads and became a head of the American Railway Union after working with the Brotherhood of Locomotive Firemen and also being an editor of the union's newspaper. Debs was best known not only as a trade union activist, but also being one of the founding members of the IWW, the Industrial Workers of the World, and one of the founders of the Socialist Party of America, as well as being their presidential candidate 5 times. Debs was a guy who did as much as anyone to bring the message of socialism to Americans. He was very much a Midwesterner, very much a American man of his time, and was one of the most popular speakers even among people who did not like socialism. In fact, people who even hated socialism would come and listen to Debs speak because they just liked him so much. Debs was also a great believer in the American dream, even though he lived in a time very much like today when the divide between the poor and the wealthy was growing, the middle class was declining, traditional skilled occupations were also declining and going out of business because of mass production. But Debs, after leading a strike against the CB and Q Railroad in 1888 and lost that, and then helping organize the Pullman car strike in 1894, Debs, as the head of the American Railway Union, believed that this strike would be successful. However, President Grover Cleveland called out the United States Army to break this strike. President Cleveland, of course, at the behest of the railroad companies, which were hugely powerful in this period, and also, of course, on the excuse that the railway strike was hindering interstate commerce in the United States. But he called out the United States military, and they shot quite a few strikers down. Debs was actually convicted because of this 1894 strike and was sent to prison for defying a court injunction against the strike and served 6 months in prison. And while there, he read quite a few works on socialist theory, including Marx, and became a member of the Social Democracy of America, the Social Democratic Party of America, and in 1901, a unification of all these parties as a member of the Socialist Party of America. Debs ran for president as a socialist candidate for 5 times, including in 1912 when he received around 1 million votes. It would have been a lot more than 1 million, but voter fraud during that period hindered that. He was very popular, but after 1912, his health started to decline, and he began to gradually retire from public life. However, when the First World War started, Debs saw the destruction, the splintering of the worldwide socialist movement, the Socialist International, the so-called Second International. Marx himself, along with Frederick Engels, had started the First International in Europe, and America was somewhat involved in that. The Second International, the Socialist Party of America, was very involved in that. However, the largest and probably the leading party in the Second International was the German Social Democratic Party, and all but one of the members of the German Social Democratic Party agreed to support World War I, when for decades the International Socialist Movement had said they would not partake in any kind of imperialist war. So that split the Second International, and in 1915 a group of anti-war socialists met in Switzerland under the leadership of the Russian Social Democratic Party leader Vladimir Ilyich Lenin, and declared themselves to be communists because they believed that the war was wrong, it should be stopped now, and that democracy was no longer enough to bring socialist revolution. Instead, the revolution had to undertake a new phase, and violence was not ruled out, which of course led to the American Revolution. Now, it was not easy to get the United States into World War I. We set out the first 4.5 years of it. And Americans did not see why we had to go fight in a war between Russia, pre-revolutionary Russia, England, France, Germany, Austria, Hungary, and a few other nations. So the United States government passed in 1918 the Sedition Act, which led to the destruction, pretty much, the Alien Act too, but the Sedition Act in particular, the destruction of the American left and trade unions, from which they would not recover until the Great Depression in the 1930s. It was made illegal to criticize the United States government, the military, or policy during the war, and any kind of seditious material found in the mail would result in convictions, which meant that the Socialist Party and other movements and trade unions and so forth that were critical of the war or the government could no longer send their publications, their newspapers through the mail. They could no longer solicit donations or receive dues from members or even sign up new members. Debs read an anti-war speech during that period and was sentenced to prison in 1920. He was so famous that he ran for president on his prison number and got quite a few votes. However, Debs was released from prison in 1921 and died in 1926 due to cardiovascular and heart problems that he developed because of old age and because of his time in prison. Debs was a true believer in America, in democracy, and in particular in socialist democracy. And he was a man who famously said, "I have no country to fight for. My country is the earth, and I am a citizen of the world." He also said, while on trial in 1920, "While there is a lower class, I am in it. While there is a criminal element, I am of it. And while there is a soul in prison, I am not free." He also said the most heroic word in all languages is revolution. Debs' legacy, along with the legacy of the American left, the Socialist Party, the strong trade union movement that was built in the 1880s, 90s, and at the turn of the 20th century, was destroyed. It was wiped out of the history books, written out of history, and history was completely whitewashed. Most people in America do not know this history, and I certainly was not taught this in school. I had to read it myself, and it's one of the things that made me a socialist and made me a Marxist. So Eugene Debs is a very good example for us all. The man put his livelihood, his life, and his freedom on the line to make the world, the country, and the world a better place for working class and poor people. And shouldn't we all be doing that today? Now more than ever, we need to follow the example of Eugene Debs and stand up for what is right, stand up for justice, stand up for freedom, and stand up for true democracy, political, economic, and social democracy in all forms and guises. It's certainly an interesting history and one that I would be glad to cover more in future broadcast or podcast. If you'd like to hear it, please drop me a line at one of my email addresses or on Twitter or on Instagram and let me know. Just a word about the music. I don't want to say too much about it because of some copyright issues that sometimes people have on YouTube. I don't want to get the program taken down because of that. But last week, the introductory music to our broadcast was the old socialist song, The Red Flag, done by Billy Bragg and Dick Gohan. The exit song, the outro song, was Pete Seeger, Which Side Are You On? This week we started off with A Gang of Four, Capital Fails Us Now, from 1980. And we are going to end with one of my favorite blues songs by one of my favorite blues artists. It's Lead Belly, and he's going to tell you all about the bourgeois, the upper class. And he, like many of us, have got the bourgeois blues. Hope you tune in next week for the Southern Socialist. Have a good week ahead, and remember, the class struggle is your struggle.
Everywhere we go, the people would turn us down, Lord, and the bourgeois blues gonna spread in years all around. Me and Marty, we was standing upstairs. I heard a white man say, I don't want no niggas up there. Lord, he's a bourgeois man. He's bourgeois town. I got the bourgeois blues gonna spread in years all around. Home of the brave, land of the free. I don't want to be mistreated by no bourgeoisie, Lord, in a bourgeois town. It's a bourgeois town. I got the bourgeois blues are gonna spread in years all around. Colored people will turn us down, Lord, in a bourgeois town. It's a bourgeois town. I got the bourgeois blues, I'm gonna spread in years all around. The white folks in Washington, they know how. Took a colored man, a nigga, just to see him bow, Lord, it's a bourgeois town. It's a bourgeois town. I got the bourgeois blues, I'm gonna spread in years all around. Tell all the colored folks to listen to me. Don't try to buy no home in Washington, D.C., cause there's a bourgeois town. It's a bourgeois town. I got the bourgeois blues and I'm so gonna spread the news.